The wind in that part of the country was a thief. It stole the warmth from a man's bones, the moisture from the soil, and the words right out of your mouth if you were not careful. It was a constant, restless thing, sweeping down from the jagged peaks to the west and across the great, thirsty expanse of the desert that bled into Cole Maddox's land. The wind carried two things in equal measure: dust and rumor. Cole had learned long ago to pay the dust more mind. It was, at least, honest. Cole Maddox was a quiet man, shaped by the land he worked. His face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the relentless glare. He lived alone on a modest ranch that was more grit than green, a collection of sturdy, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast emptiness. His nearest neighbor was a day's ride east, and the town of Redemption, such as it was, lay a half-day south. He preferred it that way. The quiet suited him. It gave a man room to think, and Cole had plenty to think about. In Redemption, they knew him not for his words, but for his actions. He was the man who had stared down 3 rough-handed cattlemen bullying a widow over a water rights claim, not moving, not speaking, until they had backed their horses away and ridden off muttering curses. He was the one who left a sack of flour and dried beans on the porch of the baker's family after the man had died of fever, never mentioning it, never looking for thanks. He had once pulled a half-starved drifter out of a snowbank and let him stay in his barn for a month, asking nothing in return. Cole Maddox had a deep and unyielding sense of justice, the kind that did not rely on a badge or a gavel. He defended those the law tended to forget, because he knew what it was to be forgotten. He was finishing his chores as the sun bled its last orange and purple across the horizon. The wind moaned around the corners of the small cabin, a lonely sound that usually brought him a measure of peace. But tonight, it carried something else, a skittishness in the horses, his gelding. Silas, a creature as steady as a rock, kept tossing its head and staring toward the barn. Its ears pricked. Cole paused, his hand on the water pump, and listened. He heard nothing but the wind and the creak of the windmill. Still, the feeling persisted. Something was out of place. With a slow, deliberate motion, he wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the barn. The big doors were closed, but not barred for the night. He slid one open just enough to slip inside, his movements silent from years of practice. The familiar scent of hay, leather, and horse filled the air, but beneath it was another scent, faint and foreign, the scent of fear. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, picking out the shapes of the stalls and the hayloft above. A floorboard creaked in the far corner, behind a stack of old burlap sacks. It was a sound too light for a coyote, too deliberate for a rat. Cole did not call out. He did not reach for the pistol holstered at his hip. He simply stood, a solid and patient silhouette against the fading light, and waited. "I know you're there," he said, his voice low and calm, not much louder than the wind outside. "I mean you no harm." A small sound, a choked sob, answered him. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows behind the sacks. It was a woman. No, it was the ghost of a woman. She was trembling so violently he could see it from across the barn. Her dress, once a simple calico, was torn at the shoulder and hemmed with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle, loose and matted with burrs. One side of her face was a dark bloom of purple and blue, and her feet were bare, scratched and bleeding. She held herself as if trying to shrink into nothing, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal all the air from the space between them. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Don't send me back." Cole took a slow step forward, his hands kept carefully in sight, away from his weapon. "Back where?" Her breath hitched. "To them, the men from the camp." She shook her head, a frantic, desperate motion. He bought me, said I was his wife now, but I won't be." Her voice broke on a sob. I was sold before, and then again, I can't do it no more." The words hung in the dusty air, heavy and ugly. Sold. Cole felt something cold and hard settle in his gut. He had heard tales from the mining camps and the remote railroad settlements of women brought in like cattle, passed from one man to another. He had always thought of them as just that, tales, but the proof was here, shaking in his barn, her bare feet bleeding on the hard-packed earth. He closed the distance between them slowly, as one would approach a terrified colt. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. He could see now the raw skin on her wrists, the haunted, hollow look in her eyes. She was half-starved and running on the last dregs of fear. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He shrugged off his heavy canvas coat. He did not try to put it on her, knowing the gesture might spook her. Instead, he laid it gently over a nearby hay bale. "There's a fire in the cabin, and food." He asked no more questions. He did not ask her name, or where she came from, or how she had ended up on his land. The story was written all over her in bruises and tears. Questions could wait. Survival could not. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving the barn door open just a crack, an invitation. He did not look back to see if she would follow. He just trusted that she would. A few minutes later, the cabin door creaked open. She stood there, hesitating on the threshold, a wraith caught between the dark of the night and the warm lamplight of his home. She had pulled his coat around her shoulders, clutching it tight as if it were armor. He gestured with his head toward the small wooden table where a bowl of beef stew was steaming. She ate like a starved animal, hunched over the bowl, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold the spoon. Cole said nothing. He sat across from her, cleaning his rifle. The familiar, methodical movements, a comfort in the tense silence. He gave her something to focus on other than him, a simple task that made him seem less of a threat. When she finished, he took the bowl, refilled it, and set it back in front of her. She ate the second bowl more slowly. He had a small cot on one side of the main room. Without a word, he took the blanket from his own bed and laid it over the cot. "You can sleep there," he said, and then he turned his attention back to the rifle. He gave her the decency of his back, a small privacy in the one-room cabin. He heard her lie down, the ropes of the cot groaning under her slight weight. Soon, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ever-present cry of the wind. The scream tore through the fabric of the night, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. Cole was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand before he was fully awake. He saw her on the cot, thrashing, caught in the grips of a nightmare. Her hands were up as if to ward off a blow, her face contorted in a silent plea. He did not go to her. He did not touch her. He knew that a touch, even one meant to comfort, could feel like an attack to someone so wounded. He stood by the hearth, a silent sentinel in the flickering firelight, and waited. He had seen this before, a long time ago. He had seen it in his sister. The screaming subsided into choked sobs, and then into a shuddering silence. She lay awake now, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Cole slowly holstered his pistol. He moved to the stove, poured a cup of water from the bucket, and set it on the small crate beside her cot. He still did not speak. Words were clumsy things in the face of such pain. He went back to his chair, stoked the fire, and sat watch until the first pale hint of dawn. The next morning, he offered her a place to stay. "You can rest here," he said, looking out the window. Not directly at her. "Stay as long as you need, until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." She was sitting at the table, wrapped in his blanket, her eyes dull and empty. "There is no next," she said, her voice flat. "Not for me." Cole turned to look at her then. He saw the resignation, the utter lack of hope. It was a look he recognized, and it stirred a cold anger deep inside him. An anger at the world that could do this to a person, that could strip them of everything, even the idea of tomorrow. "Everyone's got a next," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sometimes you just need a safe place to find it." Over the next few days, her story came out in fragments, whispered in the quiet of the evening or confessed in the hazy aftermath of another nightmare. Her name was Lenora Bell. She had been an orphan, raised by an uncle in a small town back east. When she was 17, he had married her off to a rancher heading west, a man twice her age. In exchange for $100, the rancher had been cruel in his own quiet way, treating her like property, another head of livestock. He had died a year later. Thrown from a horse, she thought she was free. But the rancher had debts, and the town sheriff, a man with a greedy glint in his eye, had declared her part of the estate to settle the accounts. He had sold her contract, he called it, to a mining foreman for $50 and a share of whatever color he found. That was the man she had run from, the one who had tried to force a ring on her finger and his hands on her body in a dirty tent in a godforsaken camp. With every piece of her story, the ghost of Cole's own past rose to haunt him. His younger sister, Sarah. She had been bright and full of life, with a laugh like wind chimes. She had run off with a charming gambler who had promised her the world, but the promises had turned to dust. The man had sold her to a saloon owner in a town 200 miles away. Cole had gone after her. He had been too young, too hot-headed. He had gotten into a fight, been thrown in jail for a week. By the time he got out, Sarah was gone. They told him she had run, fled into the wilderness to escape her life. They found her body 2 weeks later. She had not survived the winter cold. He had failed her. The guilt was a stone he had carried in his chest for 10 long years. Looking at Lenora, he felt its familiar, crushing weight. This time, he would not fail. A week after Lenora's arrival, a rider approached the ranch. It was Deputy Miller from Redemption, a young man who was more curious than competent. He tipped his hat to Cole, his eyes sliding past him to the cabin, where a woman's silhouette could be seen for a moment in the window. "Maddox," Miller said, trying to sound official. "Heard some talk in town about a woman from the Black Creek mining camp, missing." Cole leaned against the porch post, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir. Foreman's raising a fuss. Says she run off on him, stole a horse. He claims—" The deputy's gaze was sharp. "You ain't seen anyone passing through, have you? A woman, alone?" Cole did not even blink. He looked the deputy straight in the eye, his gaze as steady and flat as the horizon. "My cousin is here for a visit," he said, his voice even. "Her name is Lenora. Came in on the stage from Prescott 3 days ago. She'll be staying a while. Family matters." From inside the cabin, Lenora watched him. She saw the lie leave his lips, smooth and solid, without a single flicker of doubt. He was putting himself between her and the world, building a wall with his words. The deputy, faced with Cole's unshakable calm, seemed to deflate. He mumbled something about just doing his job, tipped his hat again, and rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust that the wind immediately snatched away. Rumors, however, were harder to disperse. They clung to the air like the heat of the day, spreading from the saloon to the general store and back again. The quiet Cole Maddox had a woman staying with him, a cousin, he said, but folks had their suspicions. That night, the nightmares came back, worse than before. After her screams faded and the trembling subsided, she sat on the edge of the cot, her head in her hands. The cabin was silent save for the crackling fire. "Do you believe I'm still worth saving?" she asked the shadows, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him, but she knew he was awake, watching. She felt his gaze like a physical presence, steady and unwavering. Cole got up from his chair. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her. He did not touch her. Not yet. He just waited until she finally lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, her face a mask of shame and despair. "I already did," he answered, his voice quiet but absolute. The dam broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another, and another. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, the sound of a pain so deep it had been locked away for years. She swayed, and this time, he caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. He held her firmly, not in passion, but in solidarity. He was an anchor in the storm that raged inside her. He said no more words. He made no judgments. He offered no empty promises that everything would be all right. He just held her, a quiet cowboy against the wail of the wind, letting his silent presence be the answer she so desperately needed. He just held on until she stopped crying. The silence of Cole's ranch was a different kind of quiet from the one Lenora had known. The silence of her past had been heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken threats and the certainty of pain. This silence was clean. It was the sound of the wind moving through dry grass, the soft nicker of a horse in its stall, the distant call of a hawk circling in the vast, blue sky. It was a silence that had room for a person to breathe. She began to move within that silence. Slowly at first, like a fawn testing a frozen stream. Her days found a rhythm, marked not by a clock but by the sun and the needs of the ranch. She started with the dishes, scrubbing the tin plates with a fierce determination, as if she could wash away more than just the remnants of a meal. Then she took to feeding the chickens, their clucking and scratching a simple, honest sound. Soon, she was in the barn, her movements cautious and alert, measuring out oats for Silas and the mare. She was always watching, always listening, her body still coiled tight with the instinct to flee, but with each passing day, the coil loosened just a little. Cole gave her space, but he also gave her purpose. He never told her what to do, but he would leave a bucket by the well or a stack of mending in a basket, and she would find her own way to the task. She learned the landscape of his life through these small chores, the worn patch on his saddle, the way he liked his coffee, the precise neatness with which he stacked his firewood. He was a man of habit and order, and in that predictability, she found a strange and fragile sense of security. One afternoon, he came out of the cabin carrying his Winchester rifle. He did not say a word, just walked out to the fence line and set up 3 empty cans on a post. He worked the lever, the metallic sound sharp in the still air, and fired 3 shots. Each shot sent a can spinning into the dust. He reloaded the rifle and turned to her. She was standing by the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching. "You need to learn," he said. It was not a suggestion. He held the rifle out to her. It was heavy in her hands, heavier than she had imagined. It was cold, impersonal, an object of pure function. Her hands trembled as she took it, the wood of the stock smooth and alien against her skin. "Tuck it in tight to your shoulder," he instructed, his voice low and even. He stood behind her, but did not touch her. He just spoke, his words guiding her. "If it's loose, it'll kick you something fierce. Line up the sight on the top of the barrel with the one at the end. Put the bead right on the can." She tried to lift the rifle, but it wavered. Her breath was shallow, her heart thudding against her ribs. All she could think of were the guns she had seen in the hands of other men, the casual way they held them, the menace that dripped from them like oil. "Breathe," Cole said. "Let half of it out, and hold. Then squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. Squeeze it slow, like you're milking a cow." She closed her eyes for a second, took a shaky breath, and did as he said. She tucked the stock into the soft part of her shoulder, squinted down the long barrel, and tried to still the shaking in her arms. The can seemed to dance in her vision. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a roar that slammed into her shoulder and echoed in her ears. The rifle bucked hard, and a puff of dust erupted a good 2 feet to the left of the target. The smell of gunpowder, acrid and sharp, filled her nostrils. She lowered the weapon, her arm aching, her shoulder already starting to throb. "Again," was all he said. They stayed out there for an hour. She missed every single time. Her hands shook, her eyes watered from the strain, but she listened. She worked the lever, reloaded, and fired, over and over. She listened to the quiet timbre of his voice, to the simple, clear instructions. He showed no frustration, no impatience. He just stood there, a steady presence, as she learned the weight and feel of a power she had never thought to hold. The next day, as she was reaching for the water dipper at the same time as him, his calloused fingers brushed against the back of her hand. She flinched violently, pulling her hand back as if burned, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. The touch, as light as it was, had sent a jolt of pure terror through her. A shadow passed over Cole's face, a flicker of something dark and pained. He did not apologize. He did not say a word. He simply stepped back, took the other dipper from its hook, and filled his cup, his movements deliberate and slow. He gave her back the space she needed, his silence a better apology than any words could have been. He never pushed, but the distance he kept afterward was a constant, aching reminder of the chasm between them. Her nights were filled with the ghosts of that chasm. She would lie on her cot, staring into the darkness, and the memories would come, unbidden and sharp as glass. They were not soft or blurred by time. They were vivid, sensory things. She remembered the face of her uncle as he counted the $100 from the rancher, his eyes avoiding hers. She remembered the rancher himself, a man who smelled of sweat and old wool, who never spoke her name, who would take her in their bed with the same grunting disinterest he showed when branding his cattle. He had not been a husband. He had been an owner. The memories of the mining camp were worse. The sheriff in that dusty, forgotten town, his smile showing yellowed teeth as he explained the transaction. "He's a good man, a hard worker," he'd said, as if describing a mule. "You'll be taken care of." The foreman, the man who called himself her new husband, had a laugh that was wet and loose. He and his friends would drink whiskey and look at her, their eyes stripping her bare, their conversation a low, greasy murmur about what he had paid and what he expected to get for his money. She was not a person. She was a bargain, a piece of property to be used and discarded. These flashes came at her in the dark, the smells, the sounds, the feeling of rough hands and cold, appraising eyes. She would wake up gasping, the thin blanket clutched in her fists, her body slick with a cold sweat. One night, after a particularly bad dream, she found Cole sitting by the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. He had not said a word when she'd cried out, but she knew he had been awake the whole time. She sat at the table, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Cole," she whispered. He did not stop the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, but she knew he was listening. "Are men like you even real?" The scraping stopped. He looked up, his face half in shadow, half in the warm glow of the firelight. His expression was impossible to read. "Only in fairy tales," he replied, his voice a low rumble. And then he went back to sharpening his knife. The next morning, she found them by the hearth, a pair of new boots. They were made of sturdy, supple leather, not fancy, but well made, with thick soles and strong laces. They were her size. She knew, somehow, that he must have guessed, or measured her footprint in the dust. He had not presented them to her as a gift. He had not said a word. They were just there, left by the fire, a silent offering. She sat on the floor and slowly, tentatively, pulled them on. They fit perfectly. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had shoes on her feet, solid, protective shoes. She stood up and took a step, feeling the firm leather support her ankle, the thick sole a barrier between her and the cold. Hard ground. It was a small thing, a pair of boots, but it felt like the first piece of a new foundation. She could stand on her own feet now. Maybe, one day, she could even walk away. 2 weeks after her arrival, Their supplies were running low. Cole announced they would be going into redemption. A knot of dread tightened in Lenora's stomach. The thought of facing a town, of being seen by strangers, was terrifying. But she also knew she could not hide on this ranch forever. She put on her new boots, a plain dress she had mended, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with weathered wooden buildings. As they drove down the main thoroughfare, it felt as if every window held a pair of watching eyes. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared. The whispers started almost immediately, a low hiss that followed them like their own dust cloud. Lenora kept her eyes fixed on the back of the horse, but she could feel the stares. She could feel the judgment. The women were the worst. Some looked at her with a hard, unforgiving righteousness, their faces pinched in disapproval. A few, she saw, looked at her with a flicker of pity, a sad, knowing glance that was almost harder to bear. The men were different. Their looks were bolder, cruder. They stared at her with a hungry, speculative curiosity, their eyes lingering on her face, her body. It was the same look she had seen in the mining camp, and it made her feel sick. Cole seemed oblivious to it all. He moved with a calm, unhurried purpose, tying up the wagon in front of the general store. "I need to see the blacksmith," he said to her. "Stay here. I will not be long." She sat on the wagon, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling as exposed as if she were naked. 3 men were lounging on the porch of the saloon across the street, drinking beer in the morning sun. She could hear their low laughter, see the way they nudged each other and gestured with their bottles in her direction. One of them, a big man with a florid face and a stained shirt, detached himself from the group and ambled across the street. He stopped by the wagon, looking up at her, a sloppy grin on his face. "Well now," he slurred, his breath sour with beer. "Look what Maddox dragged in from the desert. You must be that cousin he's so proud of." He chuckled. "Heard you was for sale. What's he pay for a pretty little thing like you?" Lenora froze, the blood draining from her face. She could not speak, could not move. "Leave her be. Jeb!" a voice called from the saloon porch, but it lacked any real force. Jeb ignored it. He reached out and put a grimy hand on the wagon wheel, leaning closer. "What's the matter, girl? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just another one of Maddox's charity cases? Just another whore looking for a roof over her head?" The word, ugly and sharp, struck her like a physical blow, before she could even process the sting of it. A blur of motion came from the side. Cole had come out of the blacksmith's shop. He did not say a word. He did not issue a warning. He simply walked up to Jeb, grabbed the front of his shirt with one hand, and hit him square in the jaw with the other. The sound was a sickening crack of bone on bone. Jeb crumpled to the ground, out cold before he even hit the dust. The other 2 men on the saloon porch scrambled to their feet, their drunken bravado evaporating in an instant. Cole stood over the unconscious man, his chest rising and falling, his knuckles already swelling and split, leaking blood into the fine brown dust. He flexed his hand, his eyes cold as stone. He did not apologize. He did not offer any explanation. He simply turned, walked back to the wagon, and looked up at Lenora. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She looked at his bloodied hand, at the fierce, protective anger that still burned in his eyes. No one had ever stood up for her before. No one had ever valued her enough to defend her honor. Men had fought over her, as they would over a poker pot or a piece of land, but no one had ever fought for her. In that moment, watching him stand there, so solid and uncompromising, she began to see a different version of herself reflected in his quiet protection. Maybe she was not just a broken thing. Maybe she was someone worth fighting for. That night, the sky turned a bruised, angry yellow. The wind, which had been a constant companion, rose to a furious howl. A dust storm, one of the worst Cole had seen in years, descended on the ranch. The air grew thick and choked with sand, visibility dropping to near zero. The world shrank to the small circle of the cabin and the barn. "We need to check the animals," Cole yelled over the roar of the wind. He fought his way to the barn, and she followed close behind, a bandana tied over her face, the stinging grit scouring her skin. Inside, the noise was deafening. The old building groaned and shuddered under the assault of the storm. Dust poured in through every crack, turning the air hazy and brown. The horses were wild-eyed, kicking at their stalls. Cole moved between them, his voice a low, calming murmur. He checked their water, threw them extra hay. Lenora helped, her earlier fear replaced by a sense of urgent purpose. They worked together in the dim, swirling gloom of the lantern light, two solitary figures against the rage of the elements. When they were done, the storm was too violent to risk the journey back to the cabin. They were trapped. They sat on a hay bale in the relative quiet of the tack room, the roar of the wind slightly muffled. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just listened to the storm. It was a wild and terrible sound, but, in a way, it matched the turmoil inside her. Finally, in the half-dark, she turned to him. His face was streaked with dirt, his expression weary. She reached out, her fingers hovering for a moment before she lightly touched his bruised and swollen knuckles. He did not pull away. "Save me like you mean it," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost in the howl of the wind. It was not a plea for him to fight for her, or to protect her from men like Jeb. It was something deeper, a plea for him to see her, the real her, buried beneath all the dirt and the pain and the shame. A plea for him to believe she was worth saving, not out of pity or guilt, but because she, Lenora Bell, mattered. He did not touch her, not then. He did not kiss her or pull her into his arms. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and clear in the flickering light. He slowly unwrapped his heavy canvas coat from his own shoulders and draped it around hers. Pulling it snug, the coat smelled of dust, leather, and him. "I ain't going anywhere," he said, his voice a quiet promise against the fury of the storm. And that night, huddled in the dark of the barn, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, with the world raging outside, Lenora Bell did not cry. For the first time, she did not cry. The quiet that settled over the ranch after the dust storm was brittle. It was a peace that felt temporary, like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. They had survived the storm in the barn, but the world outside it was still waiting, and the world had a long and unforgiving memory. 3 days later, it came for them. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, not from the direction of town, but from the north, the direction of the mining camps. They were not drifters. They rode with the stiff-backed posture of men who wore badges. As they drew closer, Lenora felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a familiar and sickening chill. She recognized the man in the lead. It was Sheriff Brody, the man who had sold her. He was a stout man, with a paunch that strained the buttons of his vest and a face that seemed permanently flushed with cheap whiskey and self-importance. His eyes were like 2 chips of slate, cold and hard. The man beside him was a deputy she did not recognize, younger, with a nervous energy that suggested he was more follower than leader. Cole met them in the yard, positioning himself between them and the cabin where Lenora stood watching from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He did not invite them to dismount. "Maddox," Brody said, his voice greasy with authority. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to Cole's boots. "We've come for the stolen property." Cole's expression did not change. His face could have been carved from the surrounding rock. "I don't have anything that belongs to you, Brody." The sheriff's eyes slid past Cole to the cabin, a smirk touching his lips. "I ain't talking about a horse. I'm talking about the woman. Lenora Bell. She belongs to Jedediah Kane, foreman of the Black Creek camp. Got the papers right here." He patted a pocket on his vest. "A bill of sale. All legal and proper. You're harboring a runaway. That's a crime." "She ain't property," Cole said, his voice dangerously low. "And this is my land. You're not welcome on it." Sheriff Brody's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. "Now you listen to me. I have a warrant here, signed by a judge. It says I can retrieve what was stolen, by any means necessary. You can hand her over nice and easy, or my deputy and I can come in and get her. It's all the same to me." He shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of his pistol. The threat was plain. Cole did not move. He seemed to grow taller, harder, a part of the unforgiving landscape itself. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. "She's not going anywhere with you." "That's your final word?" Brody snarled. "You'd break the law for that little tramp?" "That's my final word." The sheriff stared at him for a long, hard moment, his slate chip eyes trying to find a crack in Cole's resolve. He found nothing but granite. Finally, with a frustrated grunt, he reined his horse around. "This ain't over, Maddox. You'll find out what happens to men who interfere with the law." He looked at Cole, a final, venomous promise in his eyes. "You best be ready." Cole watched them ride away, his body still rigid with a cold, controlled fury. When they were nothing but two small specks swallowed by the vastness of the plains, he finally turned and walked back to the cabin. He found Lenora by the table, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice brittle. "I'm so sorry, Cole. I knew this would happen. I bring trouble wherever I go. Everyone who tries to help me ends up like your hand, bloodied or hunted." She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "You should have just let them take me." "No," he said, the word sharp, absolute. He walked over to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, his movements stiff. He set one in front of her. "No, I shouldn't have." He sat down across from her, the silence stretching between them. She was a burden, a danger to him. She had brought the law, corrupt as it was, to his door. He had every right to send her away, to save himself, but he did not. "I had a sister," he said suddenly, his voice rough. He stared into his coffee cup as if seeing a scene from long ago play out in its dark surface. "Her name was Sarah. She was younger than me, full of life. She trusted the wrong man, a smooth talker who promised her a life of ease. He took her to a town up north, and when his luck ran out, he sold her to a saloon owner to pay his gambling debts." Lenora looked up, her own misery momentarily forgotten, her heart aching for the pain she heard in his voice, a pain that went far deeper than his bloodied knuckles. "I went after her," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of fact. "I was young, full of fire and not much sense. I tried to take her back by force. They arrested me, threw me in jail for a week for assault. By the time I got out, she was gone. The saloon owner said she'd run off. Couldn't handle the life." He took a slow breath. "They found her in the spring. After the snows melted, she hadn't gotten far. I was too late. I tried to save her, but I failed." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the quiet strength, past the unyielding protector. She saw the guilt that lived in his eyes, a ghost that rode with him every single day. He was not just saving her. He was trying to save his sister, over and over again. He was trying to rewrite the one part of his past that he could never fix. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice regaining its usual steadiness. "Brody's a snake. He'll be back, and he won't come alone." He stood up. "Pack what little you have. We're riding out." They left under the cover of darkness, 2 horses carrying them and a pack mule loaded with supplies. They rode west, away from the flat, open plains and into the rising foothills of the mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. They rode for a full day, climbing higher into the rugged, silent wilderness. Just as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the landscape. They arrived. It was a small, simple cabin, tucked into a grove of aspens, almost invisible against the rocky slope behind it. It was old, the logs weathered to a soft silver gray, with a sturdy stone chimney and a small, covered porch. It looked like it had grown out of the land itself. "My mother lived here after my father passed," Cole explained, swinging down from his horse. "She loved the quiet." The cabin was one room, like his own, but it felt different. It was smaller, cozier. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a simple bed was built into the other. It was clean and dry, smelling of old wood and cold stone. It felt safe, utterly, completely safe. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall. Lenora stood at the single window, watching the fat, white flakes drift down, covering the world in a blanket of pristine white. The snow muffled all sound, creating a profound and peaceful silence. The world of sheriffs and warrants and bills of sale felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here, in this small cabin, surrounded by the silent, falling snow, it felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. The days that followed were quiet and slow. The snow fell steadily, trapping them in their mountain sanctuary. They settled into a simple routine. Cole would hunt for game, his footsteps silent in the deep snow. Lenora would cook and keep the fire going, the warmth a welcome bastion against the cold. The isolation, which she once would have found terrifying, began to feel like a balm. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the steady, reassuring presence of the man she shared it with. They talked, not about the past, not at first. They talked about small things. He told her how to tell the track of a deer from that of an elk. She told him about the wildflowers that grew in the fields back east where she was a girl. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the flickering light playing on their faces, and the conversation would drift to deeper places. She saw the loneliness in him, the deep well of it that he kept hidden beneath his quiet stoicism. He saw the flicker of a spirit in her that had not been entirely extinguished, a resilience that was as strong and stubborn as a mountain pine. The healing was slow, almost imperceptible. It was in the way she no longer flinched when he walked past her. It was in the way she began to meet his gaze instead of staring at the floor. It was in the sound of her laughter, a soft, rusty sound at first, when he told a dry joke about a stubborn mule. One evening, they sat by the fire as a blizzard raged outside, the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin. The world was a maelstrom of white, but inside, it was warm and safe. He was cleaning his rifle, the methodical movements familiar and comforting. She was mending a tear in his shirt. The silence between them was easy, comfortable. She finished her sewing, bit off the thread, and looked at him. He was staring into the flames, his profile strong and sad in the firelight. The guilt was there. She could see it, a constant shadow in his eyes. She felt a wave of something so powerful it almost stole her breath. A deep, aching tenderness, a profound gratitude, and something more, something new and terrifying and wonderful. She put down the shirt and moved to sit on the hearth rug near his chair. She watched him for a moment, his large, capable hands moving with such gentle precision. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, solid beat beneath her palm. He flinched. It was a barely perceptible movement, a tightening of the muscles beneath her hand, but it was there. His own walls, his own wounds, were as real as hers. He looked down at her, his eyes wide with a question he did not ask. She leaned in, her heart pounding. "I don't want to be used," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She met his gaze, holding it, letting him see everything in her soul. The fear, the hope, the desire. "I want to be wanted." And then she closed the small distance between them and kissed him. It was not a desperate or a demanding kiss. It was soft, tentative, a gentle question. For a moment, he was completely still, and then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, he kissed her back. He tasted of coffee and wood smoke and a loneliness that matched her own. His hand came up to cup her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek with a reverence that made her want to weep. He lifted her into his lap, and his mouth explored hers, slowly, tenderly, as if they were learning a new language together. He carried her to the simple bed, in the flickering firelight. He undressed her, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. He unwrapped her not like a present, but like a sacred text, his gaze full of a wonder that made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. He kissed the scars on her soul as much as the skin of her body. Their loving was slow and tender, and at times trembled on the edge of pain, not the pain of violence, but the pain of a heart breaking open after being closed for so long. She cried through it, silent tears that slid down her temples into her hair. They were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. He wiped every single one away with his thumb, his lips, his whispers in the dark. He made her feel not taken, but cherished, not used, but worshipped. In the morning, she woke up tangled in his arms, the blizzard having passed, the world outside silent and bright. She felt different. A quiet strength had taken root in her. She was not just a survivor. She was more. She turned to him, his face peaceful in sleep. "Cole," she said softly. His eyes opened. He looked at her, and a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. "I want to be strong," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Not just saved. I want you to teach me everything." He pulled her closer, his smile deepening. "I will," he promised. 2 weeks later, the snows had melted enough for them to travel. They did not sneak back to the ranch. They rode into Redemption in the middle of the day. With the sun high in the sky, she did not ride on the wagon or a step behind him. She rode the mare, right beside him, her head held high, her back straight. She had her own rifle now, resting in a scabbard on her saddle. She met the stares of the townsfolk, the curious and the condemning, with a calm, level gaze. They were a partnership now, a united front. But vengeance, she knew, did not simply disappear. It festered in the dark. Sheriff Brody had not been idle. The whispers that had followed them before had now grown into a low, ugly murmur. She could see it in the way some folks averted their eyes, in the hard stares from the men loafing outside the saloon. Trouble had been stirred. Friends had been turned into enemies. A trap was being set, and she and Cole were walking right into it. The return to Redemption was like walking back into a bad dream. The town that had once been a place of neutral commerce, of simple comings and goings, now felt like enemy territory. Every glance was an accusation, every closed door a judgment. Lenora rode beside Cole, her back a straight, defiant line. But inside, she felt the old, familiar fear coiling in her gut. She had faced down her own ghosts in the snowy silence of the mountains. But the ghosts of a town's opinion were a different kind of haunt. She knew strength was not just about holding a rifle or riding a horse. It was about fighting with every tool you had. The law had been twisted to hurt her, and she was determined to see if it could be untwisted to help her. The circuit judge, a man named Miller, was in town for the week, holding court in the small, stuffy room above the sheriff's office. She went alone. Cole had offered to come, but she had refused. This was a battle she needed to fight for herself. Judge Miller was an old man with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed weary of the world's endless troubles. He listened to her story with a kind of pained patience, his fingers steepled under his chin. She spoke clearly and calmly, leaving out no detail of her uncle's transaction, the rancher's death, or Sheriff Brody's bill of sale. She presented her case not as a plea for pity, But as a statement of fact, she was a human being, not a piece of property. When she was finished, the judge sighed, a long, tired sound. He shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding her gaze. "Miss Bell," he said, his voice dry as dust. "I sympathize with your predicament. Truly, I do. But the law is concerned with facts and documentation. You admit a marriage took place with your first husband. Upon his death, his estate, including his debts and assets, fell under the purview of the local authority. Sheriff Brody's actions, while perhaps unseemly, appear to be legally sound based on the customs of these territories. He holds a signed document." "It was not a marriage," Lenora insisted, her voice rising slightly. "It was a sale. I never agreed to it." "Your presence in the man's home, your cohabitation, implies agreement in the eyes of the law," the judge said flatly. "There is nothing I can do. The matter is closed." He finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and finality. "A woman's place is with her husband, Miss Bell. The law is quite clear on that." She left the office with the judge's words ringing in her ears, each one a hammer blow against her newfound hope. The law had not failed her. It had simply been built for men like Brody and Kane, not for women like her. It was a cage, and she was rattling its bars in vain. Her last hope for an ally in the town was the church. The preacher, a young, earnest man named Reverend Abernathy, had always seemed kind. It was his wife, Martha, who sought Lenora out as she stood in the dusty street, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Martha Abernathy was a woman who radiated a quiet, unshakable piety. She led Lenora to a bench in the shade of the small white church. "My dear," she began, her voice soft and full of concern, "the Reverend and I have prayed on your situation. It is a terrible trial. We want you to know that the house of the Lord is a sanctuary for all who are lost." She placed a cool, dry hand on Lenora's arm. "If you need a place to stay, a safe haven away from him, our door is always open." For a moment, Lenora felt a surge of gratitude. A sanctuary, the word itself was a comfort, but then Martha's eyes clouded with a different sort of concern. "But you must understand, child, Mr. Maddox is a good man, in his way, a bit rough, perhaps, but he has a good heart. You must not be the cause of his downfall." She squeezed Lenora's arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "A man's reputation is all he has out here. Don't drag him down with your past. Sometimes the most Christian thing a woman can do is walk away. For the good of the man who has helped her." The words were spoken with kindness, but they landed with the force of a slap. Even here, in this offer of sanctuary, she was seen as a contamination, a burden, a weight that would inevitably drag Cole under. She was not a person to be saved, but a problem to be managed. "Thank you for your offer, Mrs. Abernathy," Lenora said, pulling her arm away gently. "But I am not looking for a place to hide." She walked away from the church, her resolve hardening into something sharp and clear. If the law would not help her, and the church saw her as a temptation, then she would have to find her own salvation. She would not be a burden. She would stand on her own. She went to the dressmaker's shop, a small establishment run by a stern-faced widow. She asked for work, any work. She could sew a fine seam. She told the woman. The widow looked her up and down, her eyes missing nothing, lingering for a moment on the fading bruise on her cheek. She saw the whispers, the rumors, the judgment of the town in that one long look, but she also, perhaps, saw the desperation and the steel in Lenora's spine. She handed her a basket of torn shirts and tablecloths. "Payment by the piece," the widow said, her voice clipped. "No charity here." "I'm not asking for any," Lenora replied. While she fought her battles in town, Cole fought his own. He knew that Sheriff Brody's claim, however immoral, had the weight of a corrupt law behind it. Freedom, he had learned, sometimes had a price. He owned a stallion, a magnificent black horse named Apollo, a creature of fire and midnight, with more spirit than any horse Cole had ever broken. It was his most prized possession, the foal of the first horse he had ever owned. Selling it felt like selling a piece of his own soul. He found a buyer in a rancher from the next county over, a man who knew horse flesh and was willing to pay a steep price for the best. The transaction was quiet, conducted in the ranch yard. Cole handed over the lead rope, his hand lingering for a moment on Apollo's velvet nose. The horse nudged him, a silent question in its dark, intelligent eyes. Then the rancher led him away. Cole stood there until the horse was out of sight, a hard, aching knot in his throat. That evening, he rode to the mining camp. He found Sheriff Brody in the camp's squalid saloon. He threw a heavy leather pouch onto the whiskey-stained table. The coins inside made a dull, final thud. "That's Jedediah Kane's debt," Cole said, his voice flat. "Paid in full. You'll write out a receipt stating that the contract concerning Lenora Bell is null and void." Brody's eyes widened at the sight of the money, a greedy light kindling in their depths. He weighed the pouch in his hand, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "Pleasure doing business with you, Maddox," he sneered. Cole left with the piece of paper, the ink still wet. It was a flimsy shield against a world of hate, but it was something. It was a start. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new kind of quiet, a working quiet. Lenora sewed from sunup to sundown, her fingers growing raw, but her spirit healing with every stitch. She was earning her own keep, building her own worth. Cole worked the ranch with a silent, relentless energy. They were a team, moving in a comfortable orbit around each other, the space between them filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. They began to plan a future, their words whispered in the dark after a long day's work. Their dreams were not grand. They were small and solid, like stones you could hold in your hand. "I want a small piece of land," she said one night, her head resting on his chest. "Somewhere green, with goats. I've always wanted goats." He chuckled, the sound a low rumble against her ear. "Goats. All right. We'll have goats." "And a porch," she added, "with a swing, so we can watch the sun go down." "A porch with a swing," he agreed. He held her tighter. "Stay with me, Lenora," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "For good." She was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her. A future, a home, a life. It was everything she had never dared to dream of, but she knew the world was still out there, a hungry wolf circling their small fire. "Only if you never stop saving me," she whispered, not as a damsel in distress, but as a partner in a long and difficult fight. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him in the moonlight that streamed through the window. His eyes were full of a fierce, unwavering light. "Only if you let me love you too," he answered. It was not about his sister anymore. It was about her, and in his eyes, she finally, truly, believed it. Their peace was shattered a week later. It was a Wednesday evening, and they had gone into town for the prayer meeting. It was Lenora's idea. She would not be shamed into hiding. They would walk into that church and hold their heads high. The service was tense. They sat in the back pew, a small island in a sea of averted eyes and tight-lipped silence. Mrs. Abernathy gave them a sad, disappointed look from the organ bench. When it was over, they were the first to leave, wanting to avoid the strained pleasantries. The sun had set, and the street was bathed in the deepening twilight. They walked toward their wagon, the air cool and still. The attack came without warning. 3 figures stepped out from the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. In the dim light, Lenora recognized the stout silhouette of Sheriff Brody. The other 2 were rough-looking men she had never seen before, hired muscle by the looks of them. "Evening, Maddox," Brody snarled. "Came to collect a little interest on that debt." Cole pushed Lenora behind him, his body instantly tensing. We're square. Brody, you have no business with us." "I say we do," the sheriff said, and he and the other men started to advance, fanning out to surround them. Cole's hand went to his hip, but he never had the chance. There was a bright flash from the alley, a deafening roar that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. Cole grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled back. He caught himself on a hitching post, his hand going to his left thigh. A dark stain was already spreading across the denim. Lenora screamed. The world dissolved into a nightmare of shadows and noise. Cole, despite the fire in his leg, drew his pistol and fired back into the alley. One of the hired men cried out and fell. Brody and the other man scrambled back into the darkness, firing wildly as they retreated. Then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The street was silent, save for the moans of the wounded man in the alley and Cole's own harsh, ragged breathing. He was leaning heavily on the post, his face pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. "Cole," she breathed, rushing to his side. "It's all right," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Just my leg." But it was not all right. He tried to take a step and his leg buckled beneath him. He was a dead weight, far too heavy for her to lift. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Doors were opening along the street, figures appearing in the lamp-lit doorways, drawn by the gunshots. No one came to help, they just watched. With a strength born of pure desperation, she hooked her shoulder under his arm and half dragged, half carried him to the wagon. It was a monumental effort. Her own screams were trapped in her throat, a silent, burning knot. She somehow got him onto the wagon bed, his head lolling, his breathing shallow. She grabbed the reins and whipped the horses into a gallop, leaving the silent, watching town behind. The ride back to the ranch was a waking nightmare. Every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of agony through him. She could hear his pained gasps, feel the sticky warmth of his blood on her hands. By the time they reached the cabin, the floor of the wagon was dark with it. She dragged him inside, onto his bed, shaking with the effort and with a terror so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. She lit every lamp she could find, her hands trembling so badly she could barely strike a match. She cut away his trouser leg. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole high on his thigh, bleeding sluggishly. She did what she had seen him do for a wounded calf, washing the wound with whiskey and binding it tight with strips of a clean sheet. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering her name, his skin clammy and cold. The bleeding slowed, but it did not stop. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that the bullet was still in there. He needed a doctor. She left him for only a moment, long enough to lock the door and bar it. Then she sat by his bed, holding a cool cloth to his forehead, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable waves. She watched him bleed, watched him suffer, and felt a pain that was sharper than any physical blow she had ever endured. Just before dawn, his fever started to rise. She knew she could not wait any longer. She saddled the mare, her movements frantic. She rode back into Redemption, straight to the small house with a sign that read, Dr. Adams. She pounded on the door until a light appeared and the doctor, a small, balding man in his nightshirt, opened it. "It's Cole Maddox," she said, her voice hoarse and desperate. "He's been shot. You have to come." "Doctor," Adams looked at her, his face a mask of fear and indecision. He wrung his hands. I heard the shooting," he stammered. "I heard it was trouble with Sheriff Brody." He shook his head, refusing to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss. I don't get involved in disputes of that nature. I have a family to think of." He closed the door in her face. She stood there for a moment, stunned. The entire town had turned its back on them. They were alone. A cold, hard fury burned through her despair. She would not let him die. She remembered something Cole had told her up in the mountain cabin, a story about an old friend, an Apache healer who lived in the canyons to the south, a man who had saved his life once before. She spurred the mare south, riding into the rising sun. She rode all day, guided by the landmarks Cole had described. She rode through the night, the moon her only guide, every instinct she had learned from him. How to read the stars, how to conserve the horse's energy, how to push past her own exhaustion, coming to the fore. She found the healer's small camp at dawn the next day. He was an old man with a face like a dried riverbed, his eyes dark and full of a deep, quiet wisdom. His name was Nantan. She told him what had happened, her words tumbling out in a torrent. He listened without speaking. When she was done, he simply nodded, gathered a leather pouch of herbs and tools, and followed her. Back at the ranch, Cole's fever was raging. Nantan worked with a calm, focused intensity. He probed the wound with gentle fingers, his lips moving in a low, quiet chant. He found the bullet, and with a skill that was both ancient and precise, removed it. He packed the wound with a poultice of herbs that smelled of pine and damp earth, and bound it with fresh bandages. He brewed a dark, bitter tea, and forced Cole to drink. As Nantan worked, word was already spreading from Redemption, carried on the wind like a poison. Sheriff Brody had told his version of the story. Cole Maddox, the known troublemaker, had resisted a lawful arrest. He was a fugitive, a lawbreaker, and the woman he was protecting, the woman from the mining camp, was no better than a common whore, the cause of all the trouble. By the time Cole's fever broke 2 days later, they were outlaws in the eyes of the territory. He woke to find Lenora sitting by his bed, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes clear and steady. "We have to go," he whispered, his voice weak. "We'll ride north, lose ourselves in the mountains. We can start over." She took his hand, her grip firm. She looked at the man who had saved her, the man she loved, now wounded and hunted because of her. The old Lenora would have agreed. She would have run. But the woman who had ridden through the night, who had faced down her own terror to save him, was not that woman anymore. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "We don't run anymore. Not from cowards." The decision not to run was not a decision to die. It was a decision to live, but on their own terms, on their own land. The world had come for them, so they would make their stand in the one place they called home. A new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. But this was not the quiet of peace. It was the taut, humming silence of a bowstring drawn back, waiting for the release. The news came, as it always did, on the wind. A traveler on his way south stopped for water and, seeing the grim set of Cole's jaw and the rifle that was never far from his hand, told him what was happening in Redemption. Sheriff Brody, spurned and enraged, was not a man to let a challenge go unanswered. He had used Cole's money to buy whiskey for the men in the saloon and to spin a tale of a desperate outlaw and the wicked woman who had led him astray. He spoke of law and order, of protecting the town from a man who shot at lawmen in the street. He found fertile ground in the fear and suspicion of the local ranchers, men who were quick to distrust a quiet neighbor and even quicker to condemn a woman with a past. He deputized a half-dozen of them, giving their simmering prejudice the shiny gloss of a tin badge. They were no longer a lynch mob. They were a posse. Cole and Lenora knew it was only a matter of time. Nantan, the Apache healer, stayed for 3 days, until Cole's fever was gone and he could stand on his own, albeit with a deep, throbbing ache in his leg. Before he left, the old man had given Lenora a small pouch of dried herbs. "For the pain," he'd said, his dark eyes looking at her with a knowing sadness, "and for the spirit." The first warning came a week later. In the dead of night, Lenora was woken by a strange, flickering orange light dancing on the cabin walls. She sat bolt upright, her heart seizing with a primal fear. Smoke. She could smell smoke. She threw open the door and a wave of heat washed over her. The horizon was on fire. The dry pasture that bordered the north end of their property was a roaring wall of flame, the wind whipping it into a frenzy. sending a shower of glowing embers into the black sky. It was moving fast, a hungry orange beast devouring the dry grass, heading straight for the barn. "Cole!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. He was already moving, pulling on his boots, his face grim in the hellish light. "It's a warning," he said, his voice a low growl. "They want to smoke us out." But there was no time for anger. The barn, dry as tinder after the long, hot summer, would go up like a torch if the fire reached it. And with it, their horses, their supplies, their last chance of survival. "The well!" Cole yelled over the roar. "We need a fire break." What followed was a desperate, frantic battle against an unstoppable force. Cole, limping heavily on his wounded leg, began digging a trench with a spade, trying to clear a line of bare earth between the fire and the barn. Lenora ran to the well, the bucket seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. She worked the pump, her arms screaming with the effort, filling bucket after bucket. She hauled the sloshing, heavy pails to the line where Cole was digging, soaking the ground, her breath coming in ragged, smoke-filled gasps. The heat was intense, a physical blow that seared her skin and baked the air in her lungs. The smoke was a thick, acrid blanket, stinging her eyes, making her choke and gag. Sparks rained down around them, small, angry stars that burned holes in her dress and hair. She did not feel the pain. She felt nothing but the splintered wood of the bucket handle in her hands, the burning in her muscles, the desperate, single-minded need to stop the flames. She lost all track of time. There was only the run to the well, the creak of the pump, the agonizingly heavy journey back, the splash of water that seemed to hiss and vanish instantly in the face of the inferno. She worked alongside him, a grim, silent team, their faces black with soot, their bodies moving with the mechanical rhythm of desperation. At one point, a burning tumbleweed, lifted by the wind, sailed over their firebreak and landed against the dry wooden wall of the barn. A small lick of flame instantly appeared, climbing the old wood. Without thinking, Lenora threw the contents of her bucket at it, dousing the new fire, but leaving herself with no water to cool the searing heat that was now just yards away. She stumbled back, her lungs on fire, her vision blurring. The smoke was too thick. She could not breathe. Black spots danced in front of her eyes, and the roaring of the flames seemed to be coming from inside her own head. She took one more step, her legs turning to water, and then the world went dark. She collapsed into the suffocating smoke. She woke to the feeling of being lifted, of strong arms around her. She was coughing, her whole body convulsing as she fought for air. She opened her eyes and saw Cole's face above her, a mask of soot and terror and fierce determination. He was carrying her away from the fire, his bad leg dragging, his face a grimace of pain with every step. He had abandoned the fight for the barn to save her. He laid her down by the cabin, a safe distance from the heat, and pressed a wet bandana to her face. She breathed it in, the cool, clean water a miracle in her scorched throat. She looked past him and saw that the fire had reached the barn. The old structure was engulfed in flame, a towering funeral pyre against the night sky. They had lost. She began to weep, great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Tears of failure, of terror, of a despair so profound it felt like a physical death. He knelt beside her, his own breathing harsh and labored, and gently brushed the matted, singed hair from her face. "You saved me this time," he said, his voice raspy and thick with smoke and emotion. She looked at him, her vision blurred with tears. He was not looking at the burning barn. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw not defeat, but a love so fierce it seemed to burn brighter than the flames behind him. They had lost the barn, but they had not lost each other. And in that moment, she knew that was all that had ever truly mattered. The fire burned itself out by morning, leaving a blackened, smoking scar on the land. The barn was gone. Only a few charred timbers and a pile of ash remained, but they were alive. They spent the next day preparing for the confrontation they both knew was inevitable. The fire had been a warning. The next visit would be the final one. They brought the horses into the small, sturdy corral behind the cabin. They boarded up the two windows that faced north, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. They brought all the water from the well into the cabin, filling every pot and pail they owned. Cole laid out their arsenal on the table, his Winchester, her smaller rifle, and 2 pistols. He showed her how to load and fire the pistol, a skill different from handling the long rifle. It was a weapon for close, desperate work. Her hands, blistered and raw from the fire, did not tremble as she took it. She practiced aiming, her movements becoming more fluid, more certain, with each repetition. She was no longer just a woman he was protecting. She was a soldier in a war for their own lives. That afternoon, they wrote a letter. It was addressed to the territorial governor in the capital. In plain, simple language, they laid out their story. They told of her sale, of Sheriff Brody's corruption, of the ambush in town, of the fire. They named the men who had been there, the men who had watched and done nothing. They included the receipt Cole had gotten from Brody, a small, flimsy piece of proof. They wrote not as victims begging for mercy, but as citizens demanding justice. They asked for federal protection, for an investigation into the lawlessness that had taken root in this corner of the territory. They gave the letter and a few silver dollars to a young drifter who was passing through, a boy with honest eyes who was heading east. It was a long shot, a desperate prayer sent out into the wilderness. They had no idea if it would ever reach its destination, but the act of writing it, of speaking their truth to a power higher than Sheriff Brody, gave them a sliver of hope. They were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the idea of a world where justice was more than just the will of the strongest man. That night, the sky was clear and brilliant, a vast, dark canvas dusted with 1,000,000 stars. The air was cool and smelled of smoke and pine. They stood outside the cabin, the silence of the night a stark contrast to the storm that was gathering around them. Cole took her hand. It was rough and bandaged, but he held it gently. He pulled her closer, until they were standing chest to chest, and then he began to dance. There was no music, only the soft sigh of the wind through the pines and the sound of each other's breath. He led her in a slow, simple circle in the dust, his movements careful because of his leg. She rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. In this one perfect moment. There were no sheriffs, no pauses, no fire, no fear. There was only the solid feel of his arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her ear, the immense, peaceful silence of the star-dusted sky. It was a dance of farewell to the life they had known, and a dance of promise for a future they might never see. It was a prayer made of movement, a final, beautiful act of defiance. The attack came at dawn. A pale gray light was just beginning to touch the eastern sky when the first shot rang out, splintering the wooden doorframe. They were ready. Cole was at the north window, his Winchester resting on the sill. Lenora was at the smaller side window, her pistol held tight in her bandaged hands. She peered through the slit and saw them, a dozen riders, fanned out in a loose semicircle, using the rocks and the charred remains of the barn for cover. Brody was at the center, his face a bloated mask of rage in the dim light. "Maddox," he bellowed, "give up the woman and come out with your hands high. We'll see you get a fair trial." "You're a liar and a murderer. Brody!" Cole yelled back, his voice ringing with cold contempt. The answer was a volley of gunfire that thudded into the log walls of the cabin. The fight had begun. It was a chaotic, terrifying blur of noise and smoke. Bullets tore through the walls, sending splinters of wood flying. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder. Lenora's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. She aimed her pistol at a figure darting between 2 rocks and fired. The man cried out and ducked back, and a strange, fierce surge of adrenaline shot through her. She was fighting back. Cole was a silent, deadly force at his window. He fired with a calm, methodical precision, making every shot count. He was not a killer by nature, but he was a protector, and his rage was a cold, clear fire. One of the ranchers who had gotten too close cried out and fell, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The fight raged for what felt like an eternity. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but the cabin was a fortress, and they were fighting with the desperate courage of those who have nothing left to lose. Then there was a lull in the shooting. Lenora peered out her window and saw Brody, his face purple with frustration, raise his arm and signal to his men. They were going to rush the cabin. "They're coming," she said, her voice tight. Cole limped over to the door, checking his pistol. "Stay away from the door," he ordered her. The first of the ranchers hit the door with his shoulder, the wood groaning in protest. Cole fired a shot through the thick planks, and the man screamed and fell back. But there were others. They slammed against the door, their combined weight making the hinges strain. Suddenly, the boarded-up window to the north shattered, and the barrel of a rifle poked through. It was aimed right at Cole's back. Before Lenora could even scream a warning, she raised her own pistol, aimed, and fired. The rifle disappeared, and there was a cry of pain from outside. Cole spun around, his eyes wide, a look of stunned gratitude on his face. But in that one split second of distraction, Sheriff Brody made his move. He had crept up to the side of the cabin, unnoticed in the chaos. He kicked open the already damaged door and stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun, his pistol raised. He was not aiming at Cole. He was aiming directly at Lenora. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The look of triumphant hate on Brody's face, the small, dark circle of his gun barrel, Cole's raw cry of her name. Cole did not hesitate. He did not think. He raised his own pistol and fired, a single perfect shot across the small room. A dark flower bloomed on the center of Sheriff Brody's chest. The sheriff's gun went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. He stood there for a second, a look of stunned surprise on his face, and then he crumpled to the ground like a sack of grain. A dead silence fell over the yard. The ranchers, seeing their leader fall, their will broken, began to back away. They mounted their horses and, one by one, they rode away, disappearing into the sunrise, leaving their dead behind. It was over. Cole and Lenora stood in the doorway of their battered cabin, the morning light spilling in around the body of the dead sheriff. They were bloodied, bruised, and still standing. They walked out into the yard, into the clean, cool air of the new day. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. They walked back into Redemption later that morning. They did not ride. They walked, leading their horses, forcing the town to look at them. As they came down the main street, a hush fell over everything. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped in their tracks. The town was silent. Some of the people they passed, the blacksmith, the stable owner, gave Cole a slow, respectful nod. Others, the ones who had been quickest to whisper and condemn, averted their eyes, their faces etched with shame. They stopped in front of the church. The door opened, and Reverend Abernathy stepped out. He had seen the posse leave. He had heard the distant gunshots. He looked at the grim, exhausted couple before him, and then he looked out at his silent, watching town. "I saw Sheriff Brody deputize those men," he said, his voice ringing out in the quiet street, clear and strong. "I saw him give them whiskey and fill them with hate. What happened out at the Maddox Ranch was not the law. It was an ambush. Today, I saw justice done with my own eyes." He looked at Lenora, and for the first time, she saw not pity in a man's eyes, but true, profound respect. As they walked on, toward their wagon, she looked at the silent faces, the closed doors, "They'll never stop judging us," she said, her voice weary. Cole stopped and turned to her. He reached out and gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek. He looked into her eyes, and his own were full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Then let 'em," he replied, his voice a low, soft rumble. They never mattered anyway. The seasons turned, and the land, like the people on it, began to heal. The harsh, biting winds of winter gave way to the soft, gentle breath of spring. The snows melted, running in clear streams down from the mountains, feeding the thirsty earth, and where the fire had left a great black scar across the northern pasture, a miracle began to happen. Tiny shoots of green, impossibly bright and defiant, pushed their way up through the blackened soil. Soon, they were followed by a riot of color: Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and sunny yellow poppies, blooming with a fierce, wild beauty on the scorched earth. It was a testament, written in the language of the land, that life could not only survive, but flourish in the wake of destruction. Cole now walked with a cane, a sturdy, hand-carved piece of oak that became a permanent part of him. The bullet had left him with a limp, a constant, aching reminder of the price of their freedom. But he never complained. He moved with a new deliberation, his body a map of his history. The limp was not a mark of weakness. It was a testament to his survival, a symbol of the fight he had won. He worked the ranch with the same quiet determination as always, rebuilding what had been lost, his presence a steady, comforting anchor in their small world. Lenora, too, had found a new rhythm, a new place in the world that was entirely her own. On Sunday afternoons, after the Reverend Abernathy finished his sermon, she would gather the town's children under the shade of the cottonwood tree behind the church. She taught them their letters, her voice patient and calm. She would draw the alphabet in the dust with a stick, her hand, with its fine, white scars from the fire, moving with a steady confidence. The children, who had once been told to shy away from her, now flocked to her side. They saw not a fallen woman, but a kind teacher who opened up a new world for them, a world of words and stories. And in their simple, unquestioning acceptance, Lenora found a healing that no amount of time alone could have given her. The town, watching its children learn to read at the hands of the woman they had once condemned, began to change its mind. Slowly, quietly, one family at a time. The official word came on a bright, breezy Tuesday in May. The mail rider, a lanky young man who now tipped his hat to them both, handed Cole a thick envelope with an official-looking wax seal. They took it inside the cabin, the air suddenly thick with an unspoken tension. It was from the territorial capital. It was the governor's reply. Cole broke the seal with his thumb, his hand surprisingly steady. He unfolded the heavy parchment and began to read aloud, his voice a low, even rumble that filled the small cabin. The language was formal, full of legal terms and flowery phrases, but the meaning was as clear as the spring water from the well. The letter spoke of a full investigation, of witness testimonies that corroborated their story, of the discovery of Sheriff Brody's long history of corruption. He paused, taking a breath, and read the final two sentences. "By the authority vested in me, I hereby issue a full and complete pardon to Mr. Cole Maddox for any and all actions taken in the defense of his life and property. Furthermore, I hereby declare Miss Lenora Bell to be a free and independent citizen of this territory, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto, her person and her liberty to be her own, now and forevermore." A profound silence filled the room when he finished. Lenora stood by the window, staring out at the greening hills, but not seeing them. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear. It was a tear of release, a weight she had carried for so long, a burden she had almost forgotten was there, had finally, irrevocably, been lifted. She was free, not just because Cole had declared it, or because she had fought for it, but because the world, the official, unforgiving world of men and laws, had finally acknowledged it. Cole came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own breath a long, shuddering sigh. They did not celebrate with shouts or cheers. They simply stood there, holding each other, as the quiet truth of the words settled into their bones. They were free, together. They were married 2 weeks later, not in the church, but under the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree that stood on a rise overlooking the ranch. It was a quiet affair, witnessed only by the sky, the land, and a handful of loyal friends. The Reverend Abernathy came, his face filled with a genuine, humble joy. The blacksmith and his wife were there, as was the stable owner. The few people in town who had judged them by their character and not by the whispers of others. Lenora wore a simple blue dress, the color of the spring sky. She wore no veil to hide her face or her past. Her hair, now long and healthy, was unbound, with a circlet of the same wildflowers that grew in the burned pasture woven into it. She looked at Cole, at his strong, weathered face and the eyes that had always seen her, and her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. The Reverend Abernathy spoke of forgiveness and of love's power to heal and redeem. Then Cole took her hands, his grip warm and sure over her own scarred ones. They did not exchange rings or recite long, flowery vows. Their promises had already been made, in smoke and in blood, in silence and in whispers. As the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, she leaned in close to him, her voice a soft whisper meant only for him. "You saved me like you meant it." He looked down at her, a slow, gentle smile touching his lips, a smile that reached all the way to his soul. "Still do," he replied. Their life together became a testament to that promise. They did not forget the past. They transformed it. They rode up to the mountains, to the small, silver-gray cabin where they had found each other in the heart of a blizzard. And with their own hands, they began to build. They added a new, larger room to the cabin, felling the trees themselves. Cole teaching her how to notch the logs, their movements a comfortable, practiced dance. They turned the old cabin into a new schoolhouse, a place of light and learning in the heart of the wilderness. But they were building more than just a school. Lenora had found her calling, her purpose forged in the fires of her own history. The schoolhouse became a sanctuary. She opened her home and her heart to runaway girls, to the lost and the broken, the ones who, like her, had been sold or used or thrown away. She gave them not just a roof over their heads, but a place to heal. She taught them to read and write, to be strong and self-reliant. She showed them, through her own quiet strength, that their past did not have to be their future. Cole, too, found a new purpose. He taught the young boys who came to the ranch, the sons of ranchers and drifters, the skills they needed to survive in this hard country. He taught them how to ride a horse until they were a part of the animal, how to shoot a rifle with a steady hand and a clear eye. But he taught them more than that. He taught them how to be men. He taught them that true strength was not in domination, but in protection. He taught them that honor was not just a word, but a series of choices made every single day. He taught them to respect the land, to respect themselves, and above all, to honor women. He was raising a generation of men who would not be like Sheriff Brody, or her uncle, or the foreman. He was raising men to be like him. Years passed. The lines on their faces deepened, but they were lines of laughter and contentment, not of fear. Cole's limp remained, a gentle rhythm to his walk, and Lenora's scars faded to faint silver lines, beautiful in their own way. Their love was a quiet, steady thing, as constant as the mountain that watched over their home, a living, breathing testament to the healing power of devotion. One evening, as twilight was settling over the valley, casting everything in a soft, golden glow, a small figure appeared on the road leading to their ranch. It was a young girl, no more than 12 or 13, her dress a collection of rags, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. She was thin and trembling, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look. She walked with the exhausted, shuffling gait of someone who had been running for a very, very long time. She stopped at their gate, her body tensed, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Lenora, who had been sitting on the porch swing, rose slowly and walked towards her. She did not rush. She moved with a calm, gentle grace. She saw the girl not as a stranger, but as a reflection of a life she had once known. She saw herself. She stopped a few feet away from the gate and knelt down in the dust, bringing herself to the girl's level. She offered not a hand to be taken, but an open, welcoming presence. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "You're safe now." The girl stared at her, her chest hitching with a silent, ragged sob. And in her eyes, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope began to dawn. Just then, the cabin door opened. Cole stood there, holding a lantern. He raised it high, and the warm, golden light spilled out, enveloping both Lenora and the young girl, casting them in a single, shared shadow. He did not step forward. He simply stood his ground, a silent, steady guardian, the light that held back the darkness. He didn't stop saving her, even after she stopped crying, because love like that never stops. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.